They're pretty high. It was when I saw that, I was a little surprised at how high they were. For proponents of immigration reform, it's first of all, it's one poll, and it was on a given day, and questions were obviously written by people who support immigration reform.
Yeah, and right there, I mean, that's one of the things that kind of jumped out was those questions went to explaining a lot of what's in the bill or a perspective on what's
Right.
in the bill. So there was a lot of explanation in those questions as opposed to testing the individual aspects of concepts in the bill. How does that affect people's views?
Well, it can affect their views, but I wouldn't say, if you looked at the questions, and I urge the viewers to go look at the questions, it wasn't a push pull where it was. I don't think it was they weren't unfair questions. It was not necessarily trying to drive a conclusion, but what it did, I thought, was, look, put the Gang of Eight bill or some semblance of that kind of bill in its most positive light. Like, these are the provisions of a bill, and those were the main provisions in the Gang of Eight bill. If you had this, would you support it? And the numbers were overwhelmingly in favor of it. And so to me, I look at it a couple things. One, it shows that while the American public isn't deeply engaged in the immigration reform debate, they're following it. We know that. I mean, it's been a top issue of discussion over the last couple of months in Washington. Clearly, some of that's got to have percolated back to Kentucky, for example, for this poll. And so people are pretty supportive of some of the main proposals in the Gang of Eight. So that's, I think, a positive if you're looking at this from a reform standpoint, if that's what you want. And the numbers maybe are getting stronger, not weaker. And this is very different than in 2007, where as the debate went on, support for immigration reform got lower. You remember the phone lines, Capitol Hill blew up because so many people were calling in opposition. And the same thing with President Bush made the big push for Social Security reform early in his second term. But it does also point out the devil's in the details, where how do you actually accomplish many of these things? That could be how you could reconcile maybe this other poll that you sent me that showed a little bit less support, or actually a lot less support for some of the proposals. So I think what it does show is that the public is open. And I think as long as the argument is kept in the economic terms, that probably gives a reform bill the best chance of passage. Because that's really the people's number one concern, is jobs and the economy. And if they become convinced that a bill like this will help their economic situation, will help Kentucky, will help the country in terms of economics, they're more likely to support something like this.
Well, before we get a little bit more into the jobs and the economics and that other poll that you referenced, I did want to ask you the big, I guess, controversial issue of this Gang of Eight Senate bill has been under the concept of amnesty. Is it providing amnesty for illegal people who are already here? And the question in this current poll says, would you support it if it requires those who are here to learn English, pass a criminal background check, pay taxes, and wait a minimum of 13 years before they can be eligible for citizenship? Some of those provisions, overwhelmingly people said yes. What does that tell you? Does that mean that it cannot be described as amnesty if those provisions are in place?
Well, the opponents are certainly going to describe it, or try to describe it, as amnesty. What it does show is that when people hear the word amnesty, they think of, blanket immunity. Okay, you're here, you're fine, you're legal now.
Right, free pass.
Yeah, free pass, and of course people are going to be opposed to that. I mean, that's against our sense of fairness to the folks who played by the rules and either got to the country legally or still are waiting to try to get through get to the country legally. It also creates, we know, a terrible incentive, because then the next group of folks will say, all right, all I got to do is get to America, and every 20 years they do amnesty, and then I'll be legal again. And so you drive some of you create your own demand. But if you actually hear, like, all right, these are the things that we're going to ask of the folks who are here, and we're going to basically make them, as you said, learn English, pay a fine. They're not going to get to the front of the line. They're going to be in the back of the line, or at least a different line, and we're not really going to reward them. It also is a recognition of the fact that we have 10 or 11 million people who are here, and we need to address the situation, because if you don't do anything, if you don't deport them, and if they don't self-deport, and you don't make them citizens or legal residents, you essentially have de facto amnesty. And so again, if the arguments get shifted to, we have these people here, if they have to do these things, look, that's not blanket immunity, that's not amnesty, then that really overcomes the best argument, or one of the best arguments that opponents would have. I mean, I think the other argument is the border security argument, that until you secure the border, then it doesn't matter what the rules are in place. But I think that the word amnesty is still a toxic word and would still torpedo any kind of bill as long as the voters believe that that's what it does.
Well, the other major issue that we haven't touched on is kind of the effect on the U.S. workforce, and that was the subject of a separate poll, this one done by Pulse Opinion Research back in April. It was like it was polling a whole different other set of issues because it focused specifically on the effects on the workforce. And overwhelmingly, Kentuckians who responded in this poll said that they opposed measures that would provide additional work visas if it would impede on Americans' ability to get jobs. But that's a central piece of this too, because a lot of people say the 64,000 current work visas aren't enough for either the jobs that are necessary to fill or some of the immigrants who want to come over here. So how do you rectify both those?
Well, I think you can reconcile them by saying, of course, Americans are going to be opposed to any kind of bill that's going to hurt their economic situation or hurt the country's economic situation. So that finding of that other poll makes some sense. And this is where the burden's on the Gang of Eight to say, look, we're not going to burden your own situation. What we're going to do is we're going to, the folks who are here studying at our universities who want to start companies, we're going to let them start companies here in America. And guess what? They might hire you or your child or your neighbor. And that's going to, or they're going to shop in your store. And that's going to help out Kentucky or America. We have a real work shortage on farms and on construction jobs. And Americans don't want to take those jobs. And so we're going to bring in some immigrants to help do that. They have to address those arguments directly head on because Americans aren't going to support a bill that's going to make their economic situation worse. And so you have to convince them that it'll actually make it better or certainly no worse. And that's where I think that the proponents of immigration reform have done it smarter this time than back in 2007 because they're trying to address the concerns expressed in another poll head on by saying, on the contrary, it's actually good for the economy, and here's why, in itemizing certain reasons why it's going to be better. And that's probably where this debate's going to end up, is the winner of that economic argument's going to prevail.
So bottom line, do the results of either of these polls shed any light on how much political pressure there's going to be on Congress to get some kind of deal done by the end of the summer as the president has called for?
Well, the fact that there are these dueling polls shows there are forces that are really, interests on both sides of this issue that are really interested in the topic. So there's a lot of pressure on Congress to try to get something done. There's also a lot of pressure to get it done in the right way. This is going to be probably this and the sequester, although this NSA issue may complicate things a little bit, are probably going to be the two big topics in domestic politics over the next couple of months from a policy-making standpoint. And there is going to be a big push, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. If I were a proponent of immigration reform, I'd be looking at surveys like this and saying, hey, we're in a pretty good spot. We're much better than we were 6 years ago. If I were an opponent, I'd look at the other survey and say, look, if we can win this economic argument, we can get these, we can stop this effort, or we can get it to be more along the lines of what we would like. And so it'll be really fascinating to see how it plays out.